Hello everyone, my name is Mariko Kikutani. I'm going to present my research on emotion detection from voices. The work is already published in Cognition and Emotion, so if you are interested, please check the paper later. So, how good are we to recognize somebody's emotion from the voice only? The answer is that we are quite good at it. So we can recognize the speaker's voice from short vocalization, such as ah or who or something like that. Or even if somebody is speaking the language we don't know, we can still quite accurately detect what emotion the speaker is feeling. The central issue in the present research is what we call incongruent speech, where the speech expressing incongruent emotional cues through voice and content. So for example, somebody is saying, I'm fine in a sad voice. Although we encounter this kind of voice quite frequently in everyday life, we don't know which information, voice or content, is more important for our final decision on the speaker's emotion. So this is our first research question. Our second research question concerns the spoken language. So how does familiarity of the spoken language impact the emotion assessment of the incongruent speech? So if there isn't the native language that the speaker is talking in, then the second language that we can still understand what it said, and there is a case that the speaker is speaking in totally unfamiliar language to us. So the impact of content is expected that at least there are some for native language speech, and it should be none for unfamiliar language. And the question is, interesting question to ask is what going to happen in the second language? In order to investigate these two research questions, we gathered some stimuli. This research focused on three emotions: anger, happiness, and sadness. And we used three languages: Japanese, which is the native language of the participants, so we named it as language 1, which is L1. Second language, L2, was the English, and totally unfamiliar language was Khmer, which is the language of Cambodia. We named it as L0. We gathered two male speakers in each language and asked them to say these three phrases: I'm angry, I'm pleased, I'm sad, in angry voice, happy voice, and sad voice. So each speaker produced 9 voice pieces, and among these 9, there are congruent stimuli and incongruent stimuli. So congruent ones are the voice and contents showing the same emotion, and all the others were incongruent. So for example, angry emotion, a congruent one as angry voice saying I'm angry. But incongruent ones are angry voice saying I'm happy or I'm sad, and contents is saying I'm angry but in happy voice or sad voice. I'm gonna show you some example.
I'm angry.
This is a angry voice congruent one.
I'm angry.
So that said I'm angry in a happy voice.
I'm angry.
That one said I'm angry in sad voice. So the last two were incongruent. Although we got 9 pieces of voice from each speaker, for experiment we selected 9 for each language. So for each language there were 9 voices, kind of mixture of 2 speakers. Participants of this experiment were all Japanese undergraduate. We assessed their language ability for English and Khmer with a self-report 5-point scale. So participants were invited in a lab and tested individually. They sat in front of a laptop, and in the laptop there are online questionnaire form which in which audio files were embedded. So participants could play the audio by themselves and then answer questions and then move on to the next trials with their own pace. So there are 27 stimuli because there are 9 voices for each language and there are 3 languages. These 27 stimuli were randomly presented twice to the participants, and they listened to each voice and then answered a question, which is that rated how much they agree with the speaker's feeling anger, happiness, and sadness. So for each voice that they heard, they had to answer how much they agree for each of these 3 emotions. So for anger, not at all agree to very strongly agree, then happiness, not at all agree to very strongly agree, and then to sadness. So for each voice, we gathered 3 ratings or 3 answers. For result, we treated these 3 answers we gathered for each trial separately. And for each ratings, so for anger, happiness, and sadness, we can determine which trial that the answer was produced for was in terms of these 3 categories. So congruent trial is the voice and content showed the rated emotion. So for example, anger rating, anger assessment, congruent trial was the one that voice and content showed anger. For voice trials, for anger assessment is that the voice showed anger but content showed different emotion, and the contents trials was the one that the content showed the anger but voice showed different emotions. So in the whole experiment, we determine which trials it was for each answer. The result was plotted in this graph. So these are the languages, and these are the rated emotion. These slightly colored bar was the one that only voice showing anger or happiness or sadness, and semantic bar is only the semantic showing that rated emotion. So between these voice and semantic trials, if one of them is rated kind of similarly to this congruent trial, it determines that that modality is important. So for Japanese anger assessment, for congruent stimuli is rated very high, which means that the speaker was judged as feeling anger. Between the voice and semantic trials, only the stimuli showing anger in their voice and the trials that only semantic showing anger, there's not much overall difference of how speaker is feeling angry. For happiness, it seems a bit of semantic dominance is there. So the ones that showing semantics, which is saying I'm happy, but the voice showing other emotion gives overall more impression that the speaker is feeling happy than the ones that only the voice is showing happiness. For sadness, interestingly, no matter what the content is, when somebody is speaking in a sad voice, the speaker was judged as feeling sad, but not much for the semantics. So strong voice dominance for sadness perception. For the participants' second language, it seems that voice is more important than semantics, but the extent was much more in the sadness. The voice was much more important than semantics for sadness perception. And then for the unfamiliar language, semantics doesn't do much, and voice trials were rated as high as congruent trials. That is expected because participants couldn't rely on semantic cue. There was no emotional cue in the semantics, so everything was based on the voice. To summarize, the impact of voice and content differ across emotions. For sadness perception, the voice seems to be more important than semantics, and anger and happiness perception, where both information are considered, but especially for L1, semantic was slightly more important. Also, the impact of content is relative to the familiarity of the language. So some semantic dominance was shown for native language. Semantic was not totally ignored, but less important for non-language. And then there was no impact of semantic for unfamiliar language. However, that experiment has some shortcomings. There are only 2 models per language, so only limited variation of voice, and there are only 76 participants, so we performed experiment 2. In this experiment, we used many more different voices, 6 Japanese, 6 English, and then we couldn't get more Khmer speaker, so we added 1 Swedish speaker as voice as L0 stimuli. So, similar to the previous experiment, participants listened to 9 stimuli per language, English, Japanese, English, and L0. But in these 9, those people's voices were mixed up, and different participants listened to different combination of the speech model. There were 203 participants, and we conducted this experiment online. Participants listened to the voice and rated how much they agree with the speaker is feeling anger, happiness, and sadness. The result is similar to the previous experiment, but a bit clearer this time, I think. So for native language stimuli, for anger and happiness perception, there is a clear semantic dominance. The semantic information is more important than the voice, but these 2 are equally important for sadness perception. In experiment 1, there was a strong voice dominance in sadness, but it wasn't shown this time. But compared to other 2 emotions which shows clear semantic dominance, that wasn't shown for sadness. So therefore, we can still say that the voice information is still quite important for sadness perception. For the second language stimuli, for anger, the voice and semantic are equally important, but for happiness and sadness, the voice are more important. Then for totally unfamiliar language, semantic already didn't do much, and voice conditions were rated as high as congruent stimuli. As a conclusion, the impact of voice and content differ across emotions. For sadness, overall, it find voice dominant. Why is that? Maybe because sadness voice is calling for help, so the receiver's point of view, what they need to do is to go to the speaker and offer help or ask what's wrong, no matter what the detail is. That's why the listener's action is already determined. There is no ambiguity that the person needs some help, so that maybe the attention to content is less. Or sad voice is quite muffled and the word is hard to hear. So maybe people don't pay much attention to that. For happiness stimuli, there's a clear semantic dominance for L1. According to the previous research, a happy voice is easily being confused with the other positive emotions. So people need to pay attention to the content to distinguish it from other positive emotion. Similar thing applied to anger emotions. Again, found semantic dominance for L1. For anger, again, listeners has to decide next action in accordance with the contents. If someone is showing anger in their voice, the listener wouldn't know whether they should run away or they should approach, argue back. So that maybe the contents is important, decide what to do next. So the important modality, voice or contents, differ across emotions because the function of the voice signal differ across emotions. So it's not the consistent effect, consistent importance of either of the modality. It's more likely that the important emotion is depending on which emotion is expressed. And finally, the impact of content is, as expected, related to the familiarity of the language. This research only used very short phrase, I'm happy, I'm angry. So the next step is to use more variety of contents, especially longer sentences, to see more detail on our perception and incongruent speech. Thank you for your attention.